What my presentation, what I'm going to try to do today is touch on about 8 things that are trends that are critical that we see impacting the food needs in the future. Talk a little bit about our supply chains, but then I'm going to focus on policies that are needed to address them. And then after that, touch on some things that I think are critical so that what was just spoken about don't get impeded. So let's see. So what are the key trends? I'll mention them and then we'll go through them. Volatility, sustainability, trade, protein consumption, health and nutrition, biofuels, population growth, income growth. Gives you an overview about what I'm going to talk about, and then I'll just take them in turn. A lot of everything that you've seen over the last few years can almost be summed up in this chart in terms of commodity markets. Now what this chart is, it's one chart. The green line is basically an index of grain, rice, major oilseeds, fish meal, oilseeds, corn, soybeans, wheat futures, all put into an index. And the blue line is the percentage change of price. What that basically tells you is that because commodity supplies have gotten so tight over the past few years due to production changes, very small changes in supply cause very large changes in price. A couple years ago, a 1% change in the Russian wheat supply caused a 60 to an 80% swing in global wheat prices. Not just because of the reduction in supply, but because of the policy changes that countries put in place as a result of that change. And we'll focus on some of the policy changes that they did. This obviously has implications for animal industries as feed grain prices go up as a result of this volatility. But volatility as a result of global food production and the impact it has on price is something that's been with us for the past several years, exacerbated by policy changes as well as the drought further exacerbated the problem last year, as we're all very familiar with. Another key driving change has been global trade in food. I've always found this chart pretty fascinating. It takes a second to figure out what you're looking at. On the left-hand side of the chart are exporters of food. Those are areas of the world, North America is on the left, exporters of food, places that basically have more land than people. We have a lot of land, we can grow a lot of food. What you see, North America, from 1965 to 2010, steadily exporting more food over time. South America, steadily exporting more food over time. Interesting thing is going to happen this year. South America will likely produce more soybeans for the first time than the U.S. ever. Part of it is, with the drought last year, strong price signals were sent to the South Americans to grow a lot of beans because of a shortage last year, and they responded to the market signals. On the right-hand side of the chart, importers, more people than land. A lot of folks in China that need to eat. A lot of folks in India that need to eat. A lot of folks in the Middle East, Africa that need to eat. A lot of food going from people that have it to people that need it. And that's one of the things that we at Cargill try to do is we try to connect people that have food to people that need food. Other companies do the same thing, but that's what this chart demonstrates. A key trend, moving food from people that have it to people that need it. Another thing, big trend, it's probably not new to any of us, but we all know that as the income grows, people grow, or as income grows, people eat more meat. It's kind of a question I always ask. How many people get a pay raise? How many people get a new job? How many people celebrate their child's graduation from college or high school and go out and eat corn soy blend? Last night I met up with my buddy Lowell. We went down the street. We didn't eat tofu. We ate a Kansas City strip. Well, the growing world does the same thing. As people's income grows, they eat meat. Well, they eat animal protein. It could be milk, it could be eggs, it could be pork, it could be chicken, it could be poultry, but whatever it is, some sort of a meat protein. And that's what this demonstrates. At about $2,000 per capita, consumption of grain and cereals just levels off, flat as a table. But meat consumption steadily increases. That's the blue line, all the way up to pretty high pretty high consumption per capita. A key important trend. This chart right there is globally. This chart right here, China specifically. In 1981, China consumed 11% of the pork, chicken, and beef globally. So 11% of 108 million tons of that meat, about 10 million tons. By 2011, China was consuming 30% of that, of 237 million tons. Their meat consumption grew sixfold in 30 years. Consumption in the U.S. stayed flat. A lot of meat being consumed in China, a lot of meat going to China, a lot of grain going to China to produce meat for China. Biofuels. No discussion about a trend would be complete without talking about the shift in biofuels over the past 10 to 12 years. You can see the growth of grain in the U.S. going toward ethanol, the growth of vegetable oil going toward the production of biodiesel. Huge implications for demand, and the implications, obviously, that it has for meat production. Now, obviously, there's a big chart over here, the challenge of feeding the world, 9.3 billion people by 2050. The problem is the populations are going to grow in places where it's difficult to grow food. So a couple of challenges there. You're going to have more concentration in more volatile regions, areas where it's difficult to grow food. So here's the issue. How do you grow food in places where it's already tough to grow food? You're going to have to get food to them, or there's going to be pressure to immigrate from those areas, which creates a lot of policy problems in and of itself. So you're either going to have to get them food, become more adept at growing food in places where it's difficult to grow food, or deal with an immigration problem. So those are policy issues that are going to have to be dealt with between now and 2050. Sustainability, another key trend. We work on sustainability, extensively. I'm actually always, our sustainability efforts range from increasing energy efficiency, dealing with greenhouse gas reductions, water conservation, animal care, food safety. The thing about sustainability is that when you talk to an agricultural crowd, sustainability, for right or for wrong, is often thought about in terms how it's been defined by others. Grass-fed, hormone-free, organic, unfortunately. But when I go to meetings, and I've spent some time going to meetings with a lot of companies outside agriculture, and nobody ever talks about, organic aluminum that goes into the airlines industry, or grass-fed metals that goes into some metalworking company, or how much water was reduced to make equipment that goes into to make that camera that's recording my presentation. But all these other companies sure talk about sustainability a lot. So I think one of the things that we in agriculture have to begin doing is talking about sustainability through a different lens. How much more efficient are you? How much more productive are you? Much in the same terms that were just presented. How much more beef are we producing per cow? How much more milk are we producing per cow? What are our greenhouse gas reductions because of that efficiency, as opposed to how that animal is produced or the production practice that you produce? Because sustainability is something that has a value that consumers look at. It's no longer, is it choice, is it select, is it prime, is it red, is it white, is it Merlot? But what's your greenhouse gas footprint of that package? Because consumers are starting to look at that. They care about that. Now, one of the things that is important when we start talking about policies is it's important, I think, to understand the supply chains that companies deal with. I'll talk about ours. As we move product from areas of surplus to areas of deficit, we rely upon supply chains that are complex, where financial, physical, and political risks are part of the equation. Here's a few photos that you see of what our supply chains are made up of, everything from a corn crib to an ocean tanker. Our supply chains are as diverse as the products we produce, the countries where we operate, or the customers, the suppliers, or farmers we serve. Our supply chains includes everything you might anticipate, from elevators, mills, crush plants, packing plants, refineries, boilers, export terminals, trucks, rail cars, barges, ocean-going vessels, containers, refrigerated containers. And they also include some of the things you might not expect. In our supply chain, we have bicycles, camels that haul corn to a country elevator, cotton scales on a tree limb in Zambia, Some of our supply chains are simple. A farmer hauls wheat to a flour mill that gets ground into flour, goes to a bakery. But some of the supply chains are very complicated. We buy product in Spain, it goes to Iowa, it gets processed, loaded back on a container ship, goes back to Europe, begins an overland voyage through the former Soviet Union, through Central Asia, back into Afghanistan to feed the troops. Very complicated supply chains. Through that process, we confront all types of risks: market, weather, volatile freight rates, logistics, regulatory and labeling approvals, compliance, taxes, tariffs, sanitary and phytosanitary issues, inspections, environmental issues, labor, border inspections, and a whole host of things that go along with managing all of that. And each of these have policy dimensions that you have to deal with as you move these products from point A to point B. So let's talk about what these policies are that have to be confronted. We think a number of them are honoring comparative advantage, enabling open markets, investing in infrastructure, ag productivity, harmonization of standards, and then property rights. Comparative advantage. Folks remember David Ricardo from economics? In 1817, when he wrote his book, he basically said that the world will always produce enough food if you grow what you're good at, the right food in the right climate, and then trade. How simple is that? We believe that. Grow what you're good at, the right food, the right grain, maximize your production, and then trade. Honor comparative advantage, and we believe that it's fundamental to ensuring abundant and secure food. It's easier said than done, though, because when crops are short, people respond in politically things that are in ways that are politically what they think are politically wise for them. If you have a crop shortage in Russia, like they did a few years ago, the first thing they did was they put in place export bans. Prices were high for their consumers. We'll ban what we have. Keep prices low to our consumers. Well, there were hungry consumers elsewhere that were relying upon Russian wheat. Well, the Russian consumers were happy, but there were hungry people around the world that suffered. Prices went up globally. It undermined the incentive for Russian farmers to plant the next year, but at least the Russian consumers didn't march on Moscow. Unfortunately, the rest of the world's prices went up, and that caused a problem. So we've got to have better policy when it comes to comparative advantage in trade. No export bans. But at the same time, countries that had wheat bought more. They stockpiled. They hoarded, further causing prices to go up even higher. Another bad outcome. Often countries conflate food security with self-sufficiency. They think, look, we'll just be food secure, kind of like we have this debate about energy security. Some countries say, we'll just be food secure, we'll just grow it all. Well, the Saudi Arabia tried to do that in the 1970s. They said, look, we'll just desalinate seawater, we'll pump it up from the aquifers, and we'll grow all the food we need. And they did it. There was a time in the 1970s when Saudi Arabia was the 9th largest wheat exporter. Imagine that. It only cost them, they were able to sell it on the market. It only cost them 6 times the world price to produce it. After a few years of that experiment, they realized that they had a competitive advantage at producing hydrocarbons, and there were other countries in the world that had a comparative advantage at producing carbohydrates. Figured it made a lot more sense to trade. Except, imagine the ecological damage they did to their desert, and the water will never return. So that's an example of food security should not be conflated with self-sufficiency. But to do that, you've got to have trust. You have to have trust that those that have it will sell it to you when you need it. And that's an important component. And we are pleased that over the past couple of years, by giving this sort of message, we haven't seen the type of negative reaction over the past couple of years that we had, say, over the prior 2 to 3 years when we had these shortages. Another important component, or policy component, that's tied to this is really open markets, price discovery, and risk management. You've got to have the ability for the market to move to find its level, to incentivize farmers to plant, for consumers to ration, for grain to move where it needs to go, for beef, for pork, to find where it needs to go. But unfortunately, as prices move, often people want to blame speculative activity. They say, well, prices shot up, it's got to be the speculator doing it. Well, all that activity occurs to stimulate product to move to its highest valued use, I have in my hand, and so people have to manage that risk. I have in my hand a pair of dice. There are critics of the markets that are used to manage risk that say it's, these markets are more than a den of iniquity, a gambler's market where people pick up the dice and they roll the dice and they gamble on these markets. Fortunately, these markets exist because participants in these markets don't pick up the dice to wager on the markets. They pick up the dice to manage the risk that inherently exists because they are participants in the market. As a company that's in the business, you have more risk if you put the dice down and don't participate in the market. If you're along the corn market because you're buying with a farmer, you have more risk leaving the dice on the table. You actually have less risk when you pick them up and manage that risk. And it doesn't matter if you're in the crude oil market, the live cattle market, the derivatives market, however you choose to manage that risk, being a participant in those markets manages the risk when you're a participant than when you're not. And you need someone on the other side of that trade to help you manage that risk, and that's an important component that folks need to understand. And over the past several years, there's been a tremendous amount of volatility because of the debt crisis in Europe, the uncertainty with our own Congress in Washington over how to resolve these issues. So companies have a tremendous need to be in there managing risk because of debt issues, currency issues, volatility in freight markets. Managing this risk is important, and you can't have regulatory barriers inhibiting your ability to manage the risk as we move forward here. But you also have to be able to move your goods to market. We're right here on the banks of the Ohio River. Our infrastructure is crumbling. We've got locks up and down the Mississippi and the Ohio River. Some of them are 100 years old. Most of them are over 50. Meanwhile, the Panama Canal was just expanded to move some of the biggest ships, ocean-going vessels, through the Panama Canal. And some of our infrastructure is crumbling. So we've got to have investment in this infrastructure. But imagine how popular you are when you go around to some of these new members of Congress and say, hey, we need billions of dollars in infrastructure. They call it pork. Special interest spending. But how are you supposed to move the goods and the services that American agricultural farmers and ranchers produce if you don't have the roads, the wherewithal to move it from those that have it to those that need it? We've got to dredge ports. We've got to have locks and dams. But we're dealing with these fiscal constraints. Because I guarantee you, the competitors around the world are investing in their infrastructure. And I think there's a difference between the types of infrastructure that you need that grow an economy, that move goods and services from where it's produced to where it's needed, and the type of pork that you often read about on the front, the bad pork, sorry to our pork producers, the type of wasteful government spending that you often read about on the front page of your paper. As an example, I grew up along the Gulf Coast of Texas. Can anybody tell me one of the largest ports on the Gulf Coast of Texas that's not Galveston that no longer exists? Probably not. In the 1800s, Indianola was one of the largest ports on the Texas coast. It could withstand a lot of things, but it couldn't withstand a couple of hurricanes. All the immigrants landed there. The first shipment of refrigerated beef from the Texas Gulf Coast from the United States left Indianola. Now it's a ghost town. If you lose infrastructure, trade patterns change. Product goes elsewhere. So we've got to have the infrastructure to move goods and services where we need them. Now, Lowell talked about investment in technology and how technology causes the investment in how technology has caused the yield increases. I think this chart shows that exactly. We've had very little increase. Now, this is a yield increase chart. We've had very little increase in land under production up until about the last half a decade or so. The vast majority of production increases in the U.S. has been due to yield increases. That means technology. That means research. This shows the value of research. I bet if you put a chart here on, we've just seen one in milk production. You put one here on beef, put one on pork, tell you the same thing. The importance of research and technology to grow production. A lot of that on the grain side has been due to biotechnology innovation. But there are some challenges. We have challenges on the grain side with what we call asynchronous approval. Tests, positive tests at destination where a recipient country receives a product that's unapproved. Field escapes, product that's commercialized in the U.S. before it's approved elsewhere. And anytime we have those events, those activists that don't like biotech basically use it to say, see, it's unsafe. Why is it approved in the U.S. but not approved elsewhere? And that is used to undermine confidence among consumers in the safety of this product. And that's something that we don't really need. So we're working very closely with a lot of the big biotech companies to address this situation through an industry memorandum of understanding so that we don't have these types of events, so that the activists don't have a way to undermine this product, these products, because it's needed to meet the needs of the future. But it's a challenging situation. Because the more it happens, you end up with charts like this, which is a disaster, which is what this chart is meant to illustrate. This is a chart we use internally to figure out where we can ship beef from which plant to which country to meet the BSE requirements. So different countries have different requirements, what types of age, what types of processing requirements, what cuts to which countries from which plant. You can imagine what it's like to manage a supply chain that I just described to move this cut from this animal, from this plant to this country because of each individual country's rules on BSE. What a wreck. What's far better is when it's more harmonized. What this chart shows you is there are 7 different products from a beef carcass that get you, this is a little bit dated, I'd have to update the data, it's from last year. There's about a $60 a head value that you get from exporting product to different countries versus using it domestically. Short ribs are worth $8 in the U.S. per carcass versus $30 in export markets. Navel, when's the last time you had a beef navel? Finger meat, digital muscle, liver, ox lips, tongue. If you sold those products in the U.S., it's worth $28 a carcass, $91. One of my best examples is when's the last time anybody sat down and had a big old helping of pork rectum? What's it worth in China? John Casper? $8 a pound. You imagine? People don't pay that for T-bone sometimes. But that's where finding the right price, the right market for different cuts is why it's worth, opening up these markets for product. To do that, you've got to have harmonized rules so that you eliminate inconsistency, you eliminate trade friction, you eliminate delays, and you eliminate creating customer confusion that activists can kind of drive a freight train through to prevent undermining consumer confidence. Now, one last thing before I talk about messaging, and I don't know how much time I have left, I've lost track. Property rights. I think this is something people forget about because we take them for granted. Show of hands. How many people left their house this morning worried about the sanctity of your car title, your deed of trust on your house, so that thinking that a squatter might show up and claim your house is his own when you get home tonight? Anybody? In the developing world, that's a daily concern. I talked to a guy in Brazil that has neighbors that on a routinely basis get in running gun battles with neighbors over people trying to claim his property. In the developing world, property rights is a big issue. Huge issue. But it was a big issue in the U.S. in the 17 and 1800s. Places like Kentucky, where we are now, Tennessee, Virginia, is where the property rights of the U.S. weren't written. It's where they were discovered. And what property rights are important for is so that people can take the wealth that they possess, the property that they own, and turn it into capital. There's a wonderful book. I read a lot of books, but there's very few I read more than once. There's a wonderful book called The Mystery of Capital, Why It Works in the West and Fails Everywhere Else by Hernando de Soto. And why capitalism works here is because we have property rights. Because we can take our wealth, we can take our property and turn it into capital. And we can buy a business. We can start a food truck. We can borrow against it. Why is that important for food security? So that a farmer in the developing world can improve their operation. Or so that a consumer, an urban consumer in the developing country, can start their own business and improve their own capacity to buy food if they're in a food insecure country. So property rights is often something that's not talked about enough or thought about enough in this context. If you can grow an economy in a developing world, they're no longer food insecure if they have the capacity to buy their food. So I think it's important to often think about. Now the values question. Values versus technology, the theme of the conference. I always find it amazing. I didn't bring my BlackBerry up here. That people will wait in line for hours and hours and hours, days, to buy that new gadget outside a store. But by golly, introduce a new bit of agricultural biotechnology and they'll protest in the street for days and days and days and keep ag biotechnology from becoming a product for 25 years. Despite the fact that the supply chain for tin, that little element that sits there nicely on the periodic table, has a supply chain that would make the most ardent capitalist shamefaced. Have you read the Bloomberg article on the tin supply chain? The little element that goes into making all these devices? My gosh. Whew. We ought to be ashamed. But yet, all these activists that hate biotech, they'll chain themselves with sleeping dragons and then use that same technology to photograph themselves with their, I don't want to talk about a product, with their smartphone, blog about it, put it all over their Facebook page about how proud they are shutting down this biotechnology. And then we scratch our heads here in agriculture saying, but look what good we're doing with this technology. What a bunch of hypocrites. Why aren't we winning that debate with our kind of technology? Good question. It's a dichotomy we have to manage. I think that we have a situation where we have produced food anonymously for so long, we've kind of gotten used to it. I talked about the issue of sustainability. You know, our CEO talks about story food. People like to know where their food came from, where their farmer came from. And I've talked to a lot of farmers, and there are a lot of meetings where people hear about, community-supported agriculture, knowing your farmer, and they kind of think that's kind of funny. But I talked to my dad the other day, and I said, Dad, when we were farming, let's talk about all the farmers that we used to farm all our corn and beans. And remember how we used to go around and Miss Weber would give us some corn. And Miss Piegza would give us those homegrown eggs that Grandma would make her kolaches with, were checked. That wasn't nothing weird about that. There are a lot of people in the country that value what farmers do. And they're so far removed from it that they want to feel what we feel when we produce it. And I think that there's too many people in agricultural production like us. We feel it every day. We know it every day. We're proud of what we do. There are a lot of urban consumers that want to feel it too. And their outlet is like a community-supported ag. And you know what? Too many people in production ag, because I've seen them do it, they denigrate it. They think it's kind of silly. I think we should embrace it. Because if you look at the continuum of people in agriculture or in production, there's probably a small percentage of people that are truly trying to limit what we do and how we do it. And there's a lot of people out there that are going to eat what we produce no matter what we do. But too often, we set our agenda by listening to the activist types, and we respond to the activist types. And we kind of ignore the people that could be influenced by the activist types. So what happens is when an activist type says, you do this, 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 and this, and isn't this terrible, what do we say? No, we don't. I think in order to address that, we have to say what message resonates with the rank-and-file consumer in a more constructive way. Because I think what's at risk is how do we meet the needs of the hungry for the future? And that's what we're trying to do, is move food from people that have it to people that need it. Because we've treated it like it's a values question. If they won't buy our product, they don't share our values. But I think it might just be a preference question. They might just not prefer the product I'm making. I'm growing it, I'm producing it, they might not prefer it. But if we treat it like a values question, and we alienate them and we isolate them, then we risk a regulatory backlash that creates a scenario where we can no longer produce it. We can no longer offer it, not to them, but not to anyone. And the persons that suffers isn't just them, it's the hungry around the world that needs to consume a product. And that's why policy matters, and that's why policy is important.